The Bluebird Diner sat on the edge of Route 47 like it had been there since the highway itself was poured, its faded blue paint and flickering neon sign announcing open 24 hours to anyone passing through Lincoln County at 3 in the morning. Sarah Mitchell had worked the graveyard shift for 6 years now, ever since her husband died and left her with 2 kids and a mortgage that wouldn't pay itself. The diner was mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional trucker stopping for coffee and pie, maybe a drunk college kid sobering up before driving home. She'd wiped down the same counter so many times she could do it in her sleep, had memorized every crack in the vinyl booths, every stain on the checkered floor that wouldn't come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of tired that only exists between midnight and dawn. Sarah had just refilled the ketchup bottles when she heard the rumble of a large vehicle pulling into the parking lot. She looked up through the window and saw a military transport van, the kind that ferries soldiers between bases, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Her heart did a little jump in her chest. Her son Marcus was in the army, stationed overseas, and every time she saw a uniform she thought of him, wondered if he was safe, if he was eating enough, if he thought about home. The door chimed as it opened and a group of soldiers filed in, maybe 8 or 9 of them, all young, all exhausted. They moved with that particular kind of tiredness that comes from traveling for days, their uniforms rumpled, their faces showing the strain of whatever journey had brought them here. They took up 3 booths in the back, dropping their duffel bags on the floor with heavy thuds that echoed through the empty diner. Sarah grabbed her order pad and headed over, putting on her best customer service smile even though her feet ached and she had 4 more hours until her shift ended. The soldiers were talking quietly among themselves, their voices rough with fatigue. She caught fragments of conversation, something about a 14-hour layover, a missed connection, a bus that broke down outside Kansas City. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, sat slightly apart from the others, staring out the window at nothing in particular. His uniform looked newer than the rest, less worn, and there was something about the way he held himself that made Sarah's waitress instincts kick in, that sixth sense she'd developed over years of reading people across a counter. Sarah approached the table with menus tucked under her arm, her practiced waitress smile firmly in place, despite the early hour and the weight pressing down on her shoulders from another endless shift. The soldiers looked up at her with tired eyes, the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep and doesn't wash out with a single night's sleep. She passed out the menus one by one, her hands moving automatically through the routine she'd performed thousands of times before. Most of the soldiers started scanning the breakfast section immediately, their stomachs probably growling after whatever long journey had brought them to this forgotten stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The kid sitting alone, the one who'd caught her attention when they walked in, didn't even open his menu. He just kept staring out the window at the empty parking lot, at the darkness beyond the reach of the diner's lights. Sarah took orders from the main group first, scribbling down requests for pancakes and eggs and bacon, coffee with cream, orange juice, the kind of hearty breakfast that soldiers always seemed to need. They were polite, called her ma'am, thanked her for each small thing she did. It reminded her so much of Marcus, the way he'd been raised to show respect, to say please and thank you, to treat service workers like human beings instead of furniture. When she got to the young soldier, sitting alone, she paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. He had dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises, and his hands were clasped together on the table so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. She waited a moment, giving him time to notice her standing there, but he seemed lost in his own head, somewhere far away from this diner, far away from Route 47, maybe far away from this country entirely. Finally, she cleared her throat gently, and asked what she could get him. He blinked, seeming to come back from wherever his mind had gone, and looked up at her with eyes that held something she recognized immediately, because she'd seen it in the mirror often enough. After her husband died, that particular kind of grief that makes the world feel like it's happening to someone else. He said he wasn't hungry, his voice barely above a whisper, rough like he hadn't used it in a while. Sarah's mothering instincts kicked into overdrive. She'd seen that look before, had worn it herself, and she knew that nothing good came from letting someone sit alone in their pain, with an empty stomach on top of everything else. She told him gently that he needed to eat something, that they had a long way to go still, that he'd feel better with some food in him. He shook his head, said he didn't have much money anyway, that the other guys had pooled their cash for breakfast, but he was broke until payday. Something about the way he said it, the resignation in his voice, the defeat, made Sarah's decision for her. She told him not to worry about it, that she'd take care of it, that he should order whatever he wanted. The young soldier looked up at Sarah with surprise, his eyes widening slightly like he couldn't quite process what she'd just said. He started to protest, to tell her that wasn't necessary, that he couldn't accept that, but she waved him off with the kind of authority that comes from years of mothering and decades of dealing with stubborn customers who don't know what's good for them. She told him she had a son in the service, that someone somewhere was probably looking out for Marcus the same way she was looking out for him right now, that this was just how things worked, how they were supposed to work anyway. The soldier's face did something complicated then, a series of emotions flickering across his features too quickly for Sarah to name them all, but she caught grief and gratitude, and something that looked like it might break into tears if she kept looking at him too directly. He nodded slowly and finally opened the menu, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the laminated pages. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu anyway, just scrambled eggs and toast, but Sarah wrote down the full breakfast special in her notepad, the one that came with eggs and bacon and pancakes and hash browns, the one that would actually fill up a growing kid who looked like he hadn't eaten properly in days. She figured she could pay the difference herself if her boss gave her trouble about it, which he probably wouldn't because even Stan had a heart somewhere under all that gruffness and cigarette smoke. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, the soldier spoke again, his voice still rough but a little stronger now. He asked her where her son was stationed. Sarah told him about Marcus, about how he was deployed in Afghanistan, about how she hadn't seen him in 8 months, about how she checked her phone obsessively every day waiting for messages that sometimes took days to come through. The soldier nodded like he understood something about that kind of waiting, that kind of absence. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a photograph that was clearly well worn, the edges soft from being handled too many times. He held it up for Sarah to see. It was a picture of another young soldier, older than the kid sitting in front of her, with the same dark hair and the same shape to his eyes. The soldier's voice cracked when he said that was his brother, that his name was David, that he'd been killed 3 weeks ago in a firefight outside Kandahar. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, had played out in her head, what it would feel like to get the news about Marcus, but experiencing it secondhand was somehow worse than her nightmares because it made the possibility real, made it solid and undeniable instead of just a fear she could push away when it got too big. She reached out without thinking and put her hand on the young soldier's shoulder, squeezed it gently the way she would have wanted someone to do for her if she ever got that knock on the door, that phone call in the middle of the night. The soldier, whose name Sarah learned was James, started talking, the words tumbling out like they'd been dammed up inside him for weeks, with no outlet, no one to tell, nowhere for the grief to go except around and around in his own head, until it drove him crazy. He told her about David, about how his brother had been his hero growing up, had been the one who convinced him to enlist, had promised they'd serve together and watch each other's backs, the way brothers were supposed to do. He told her about how David had been 3 days from the end of his deployment, 3 days from coming home, from seeing their parents again, from meeting his newborn niece, who'd been born while he was overseas, and who he'd only seen in pictures sent through spotty internet connections. He told her about the IED that had been hidden in a market street, about how David had been walking point, about how he'd never had a chance. James said he'd been stateside when it happened, finishing up his training, and the news had come through official channels first, then through phone calls and messages that moved through the military community like ripples on water. He said he'd got an emergency leave for the funeral, that he'd just come from Arlington National Cemetery where they'd buried David with full military honors, that he was supposed to be heading back to his base now to complete his own deployment orders, to go overseas, to the same region where his brother had died. The other soldiers at the neighboring tables had gone quiet, Sarah realized, their conversations trailing off as they listened to James talk. Some of them were looking down at their plates, Others were staring at nothing in particular, and she understood that this story was theirs too in some way, that every one of them knew someone who hadn't come home, or knew someone who knew someone, that the loss rippled out in concentric circles that touched everyone who wore the uniform. James said his parents had begged him not to go, had tried to convince him to request a discharge or at least a different assignment, anything that would keep their remaining son safe after they'd already buried one. He said he'd thought about it, had been thinking about it every mile of this bus ride, had been turning it over in his mind until he couldn't tell anymore what was the right thing to do, and what was just fear and what was honor, and what was stupidity. He said he didn't know if he was being brave or if he was running away from dealing with his grief, if he was honoring David's memory or dishonoring his parents' wishes, if any of it mattered or if it was all just random chance and chaos dressed up in uniforms and flags and ceremonies that made people feel like there was meaning in the meaninglessness. Sarah listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned to do over years of late-night shifts, when lonely people needed someone to hear them, when the words mattered less than the act of saying them out loud to another human being. Something shifted in the diner after James finished talking, the air itself seeming to hold its breath in the wake of his words. One of the other soldiers from his group, a sergeant with grey in his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many deployments, cleared his throat and said he'd known David, had served with him 2 years back in Iraq. He said David had been one of the good ones, the kind of soldier who kept morale up even when things got bad, who shared his care packages with anyone who needed them, who remembered everyone's birthday, and always had some stupid joke ready to cut through the tension. Another soldier chimed in saying he hadn't known David personally, but he'd heard about what happened, about how David had spotted something suspicious moments before the IED detonated, and had shouted a warning that saved 3 other soldiers, even though there hadn't been time to save himself. The information hit James like a physical blow, his face going pale, and then flushing red, as tears finally broke through the surface of whatever dam he'd been holding them behind. Sarah felt her own eyes burning, felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought too long about Marcus being in danger, about the randomness of who came home and who didn't, about the families left behind to make sense of sacrifices they never asked anyone to make. She noticed movement from the corner of the diner where a trucker had been sitting alone, working on a plate of meatloaf. He stood up slowly, his weathered face thoughtful, and walked over to the soldiers' tables. He said his son had been a Marine, killed in Fallujah back in 2006, said he'd been driving long-haul routes for nearly 20 years now, and every time he saw soldiers he thought of Tommy, wondered who they were, where they were going, if they'd make it home. He reached into his wallet and pulled out 2 $20 bills, placed them on the table in front of James and said breakfast was on him, said it was the least he could do. Sarah felt something break open in her chest, that particular sensation of witnessing human goodness that always made her believe maybe the world wasn't as broken as it seemed on her darkest days. She excused herself and went back behind the counter where Stan was working the grill, his thick arms covered in old tattoos and burn scars from decades of short-order cooking. She told him what was happening, about James and David, about the trucker's gesture, and asked if maybe they could comp the whole table's meals, that she'd pay for it herself if she had to. But she thought maybe this was one of those moments where doing the right thing mattered more than the bottom line. Stan looked at her for a long moment, his gruff exterior cracking just enough to show the soft heart she'd always suspected was underneath, and he said to ring it all up as employee meals, that corporate could deal with it if they had questions, that he'd been in Vietnam and he knew what it was like to come home to a country that couldn't decide if you were a hero or a monster. Word spread through the diner in that mysterious way that information moves in small communities and late-night spaces where everyone's a little bit vulnerable and a little bit lonely and a little bit desperate for connection. The cook's assistant, a college kid named Brandon, who was working his way through community college one graveyard shift at a time, came out from the kitchen and added a crumpled $10 bill to the growing pile on the counter, saying his uncle had lost both legs in Desert Storm and still woke up screaming some nights 30 years later. A couple who'd been sitting in a booth by the window, their road trip temporarily interrupted by the drama unfolding around them, got up and approached Sarah to ask if they could help somehow. The wife had tears streaming down her face, and her husband's jaw was set in that particular way. men's jaws get when they're trying not to cry in public. They insisted on paying for all the soldiers' meals plus leaving an extra $100 that Sarah could use however she saw fit. Sarah tried to refuse the money, tried to tell them that Stan had already comped the meals, but they pressed the bills into her hand and said they had 3 kids at home and couldn't imagine the pain of losing one, that this was the least they could do, that they wished they could do more. Sarah's co-worker Rita came in for the morning shift an hour early, took one look at the scene and immediately understood what was happening. She'd been working at the Bluebird even longer than Sarah, had been there since the 80s when the diner had a different name and different owners, but the same essential character. She tied on her apron without a word and started making fresh coffee, the good stuff from the back that they usually saved for the owner and his friends, the kind that actually tasted like something other than brown water and regret. She pulled out the special cinnamon rolls that were meant for Sunday morning church crowd, the ones made from scratch with her grandmother's recipe, and started warming them up even though Stan would probably give her grief about it later. One by one, people in the diner who'd been minding their own business found themselves drawn into the moment, found themselves unable to sit by while a young man grieved his brother and faced his own uncertain future. A businessman in a rumpled suit who'd been working on his laptop in the corner booth ordered desserts for the entire table, pies and cakes and sundaes, saying sugar wouldn't fix anything but sometimes sweetness helped, sometimes it reminded you that there were still good things in the world worth tasting. An elderly woman who'd been nursing a cup of tea for the past hour shuffled over to James's table with her purse clutched in her arthritic hands, pulled out a rosary that looked like it had been worn smooth by decades of prayers, and pressed it into his palm. She said she'd prayed her husband home from Korea, her son home from Vietnam, her grandson home from Iraq, and she'd pray James home too if he'd let her. That prayer didn't always work, but it was something, it was what she had to give. James sat surrounded by strangers who'd somehow become something more in the space of an hour, his face wet with tears he'd stopped trying to hide, the photograph of David still clutched in one hand, and the rosary from the elderly woman in the other. The food arrived in waves, plates piled high with more breakfast than the soldiers could possibly eat, the smell of coffee and bacon and fresh cinnamon rolls filling the diner with a warmth that went beyond temperature. Sarah watched as James looked around at the faces watching him, at the pile of money on the counter that had grown to several $100s, at his fellow soldiers who'd closed ranks around him without being asked, at the ordinary Americans who'd opened their hearts and wallets to a kid they'd never met before and would probably never see again. She saw something shift in his expression, saw the weight that had been pressing down on him since he walked through the door begin to lift just slightly, not disappearing but becoming bearable in a way it maybe hadn't been before. He stood up slowly, his legs a little unsteady, and cleared his throat. He said he didn't know what to say, that he'd spent the last 3 weeks feeling completely alone even when surrounded by people, feeling like no one could understand what he'd lost or what he was facing. He said his brother had believed in service, had believed in protecting people, had believed that some things were worth sacrificing for even if you didn't always agree with the politicians making the decisions or the wars they declared. He said David had told him once that the military wasn't really about guns and combat and all the Hollywood bullshit. It was about the person standing next to you, about knowing someone had your back when everything went sideways, about being part of something bigger than yourself. James said he'd been questioning whether any of that was true or if it was just propaganda, just words used to make sense of senseless deaths, but standing here in this diner at dawn, surrounded by people who cared about a stranger's grief, he thought maybe David had been right after all. He said he was still going to complete his deployment, was still going to get on that bus when it came, and ride it all the way to the base where he'd ship out to the same dangerous region where his brother died, but he was going with a different feeling now, going with the memory of this morning, and these people and this kindness as a reminder of what he was actually protecting. The diner erupted in applause, the kind of spontaneous emotional release that happens when a room full of people who've been holding their breath finally let it out all at once. Soldiers stood and saluted their fellow serviceman, civilians clapped and wiped at their eyes. Stan even banged his spatula against the grill in approval, the metallic clang echoing through the space like a bell marking something important, something that would stay with everyone present long after they left this diner and returned to their ordinary lives. Dawn broke over Route 47 in shades of gold and pink that painted the empty highway in colors too beautiful for the heaviness of the moment. The military transport van pulled up outside the Bluebird Diner right on schedule, its driver honking twice to signal it was time to move. The soldiers gathered their duffel bags and stood, some of them moving stiffly from having sat too long, others reluctant to leave the bubble of warmth and safety the diner had provided. James was the last to stand, carefully folding the photograph of David and returning it to his wallet, tucking the rosary into his uniform pocket where he could feel it against his chest. He approached Sarah, who'd been watching from behind the counter, her shift finally ending just as the soldiers were leaving, perfect timing or divine intervention depending on what you believed. He tried one more time to give her money for the meal, but she refused, told him to use it to call his parents when he got to base to tell them what happened here, to remind them that there were good people in the world watching out for their son. He nodded and then did something unexpected, pulling Sarah into a hug that lasted just long enough to say everything that couldn't be said in words. She hugged him back fiercely, thinking of Marcus, thinking of David, thinking of all the young men and women who put on uniforms and walked into danger while the rest of the world slept peacefully in their beds. When they separated, James had one more thing to say. He told Sarah that her kindness, the meal, the listening, the caring, it meant more than she could possibly know, that he'd been in such a dark place when he walked through that door and he wasn't sure he'd been planning to complete his deployment, wasn't sure he'd been planning to complete much of anything. Sarah felt ice water in her veins at the implication, at how close this moment had come to ending very differently. James said he'd been sitting in that booth thinking about ways to make the pain stop, about how maybe his parents would be better off not having to worry about losing another son if there was no son left to lose, about how tired he was of carrying the weight of grief and guilt and fear. He said the meal and the money and the stories and the community had reminded him that life was worth living even when it hurt, that connection was real even between strangers, that his brother's death didn't have to be compounded by his own, that he could choose to honor David by living fully and serving well instead of by giving up. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face openly now, not caring who saw, not caring that her mascara was probably running or that her carefully maintained professional waitress demeanor had completely crumbled. She told James to stay alive, to come home, to write to her if he ever needed someone to talk to, that the Bluebird would always be here, that she would always be here. He promised he would, thanked her again, and headed out to join the other soldiers boarding the van. Sarah stood in the doorway of the diner watching as the transport van pulled away, watching as it disappeared down Route 47 toward whatever future awaited those young men and women in their pressed uniforms and heavy boots. Rita came up beside her and put an arm around her shoulders, both of them silent as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the morning shift began in earnest. The money that had been collected sat on the counter in a neat pile, several $100s from strangers who'd been moved by one young man's grief and had responded with the best of what humanity had to offer. Sarah and Rita decided to start a fund, a way to help soldiers passing through who needed a meal or gas money or just a moment of kindness. They put a jar by the register with a simple handwritten label that said "For those who serve," and by the end of that first day it was already half full of dollars and coins from regular customers who'd heard the story and wanted to be part of something good. The story of what happened that morning at the Bluebird Diner spread through Lincoln County and beyond, carried by the businessman who posted about it on social media, by the couple who told their kids about it when they got home, by the trucker who shared it on his CB radio with other drivers up and down route. It became one of those stories that people told to restore their faith in humanity, to remind themselves that kindness still existed, that communities still cared, that sometimes a simple act of compassion could save a life. Sarah never heard from James directly, but 6 months later she received a letter forwarded through military channels. It was brief, written in neat handwriting on plain paper, saying he'd made it through his deployment, that he thought of that morning off, that he'd shown the photograph of David to his fellow soldiers, and told them about the diner and the waitress, and the strangers who'd reminded him why life was worth fighting for. He said he was home now, that he was seeing a therapist to deal with his grief and his trauma, that he was going to be okay. Sarah pinned the letter to the bulletin board behind the counter where it stayed for years, yellowing with time but never forgot. A reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures echo louder than we ever know, that compassion is never wasted, and that we're all connected in ways we can't always see until a moment of crisis reveals the invisible threads that bind us together.